they say when it's not lives, but they're going to die from smoke. Yes.
Okay. Thank you all for coming here and being part of this session. And it's very interesting indeed when you consider that the theme itself for this conference was tobacco harm reduction is here for good. And it's not going to be here for good if we don't understand what the basic requirements are, which are human rights and the legal challenges that are facing all of us. And that's why all of us have been coming here together to exchange ideas, to understand which each of us countries have been going through, and what the state of tobacco harm reduction is in each one of our spheres. Now, each one of us here has been a former tobacco user, and we have found various means to quit that habit and move to safer nicotine products, but then our right to use these products, the right to these safer alternatives, is under threat and challenge. I'm Jagannath. I'm from India. I represent the Vapers Association of India. I've recently been drafted into the board of INCO, so thank you. And I'm here for this really, hopefully very engaging debate, because this is something that we haven't really talked about or looked about, because we have always taken our human rights for granted until somebody steps on them. Right? So with me is Tomas O'Gorman, who's another member from INCO. He's a lawyer. Gerry here, he's, well, no introduction needed really, I mean, because he's been there, done that, and he keeps doing it. And thank you so much for being here, Gerry. Right? Fiona, thank you for being here. Your insights on what goes on behind the closed doors of parliaments when we discuss and debate such things would be very, very insightful as we look at legal challenges. And David, thank you for being here. Your wealth of experience hopefully will enlighten this room with some ideas. Okay. Perhaps we can briefly start with talking about what we have presented. I hope all of you have seen the videos that our panelists have put forward. I'm not supposed to be talking much, so I didn't put out one video for myself. But having said that, if you could just kind of briefly touch upon the reasons for you picking what you did, that I think would be a good start off. Tomas, if you could start.
Yes. Well, I'm Tomas O'Gorman from Puebla, Mexico. I'm a vapor, I'm a consumer. And when I was honored to participate in this panel, I was just thinking what human rights related to safer nicotine. Because the first one that comes to mind, as I say in the video, is the right to health. That's what we listen through the whole GFN. That's the subject or the right that it's always argued by tobacco control. But there are others. There are other human rights, because dignity, human dignity is one, and the several aspects of the person cannot be fully developed, or happiness cannot be achieved if we don't protect all the aspects of the human being. And then after considering right to health, it was the right to autonomy, or the freedom to the development of the personality, which, by the way, has been recognized by the Supreme Court in Mexico when they declared the unconstitutionality on the previous ban of commercializing cigarettes. But there are others. The right to information, because this right is instrumental to to exercise the right of autonomy and the right to health, and therefore the right to harm reduction, which I'm sure Gerry will talk about, and here is the presentation, because the right to harm reduction itself enables the best way to exercise both autonomy and health, right? And finally, I introduce one more, which is the right of consumers to have a significant participation in the design of the harm reduction policies and e-cigarette regulations, because smokers were not allowed to participate in the creation of the FCTC. They are not allowed, or were not allowed to participate in the creation of anti-tobacco laws, at least in Mexico. And as Jacob Cryer says, they consider smokers are as per people that are to be acted upon, not to be listened. And I think it is time for vapers, for consumers, to be listened and to have this meaningful participation in the creation of regulations and provisions that in every country will regulate vaping.
Thank you, Tomas. To just kind of take that perhaps just a little forward to continue. Unfortunately, the way it appears to be that the minute you picked up a tobacco product or a smoke, we seem to have surrendered all our rights. That's what seems to be the general practice, isn't it? What are your thoughts on something like that? In your quest for rights and trying to determine what are those rights that are indeed available to us as consumers and our quest for safer nicotine products, why is it that a tobacco user seems to have given up all these rights? Any kind of ideas on that one?
No, actually, when someone smokes, he's exercising his right to autonomy. He's being punished because of he smokes, but maybe we don't have a right to smoke, but we have a right to choose smoking. Now, I think that the problem is that in tobacco control, they are focusing only on one right, which is health. And when you don't consider the other rights, then you don't care if the interventions and the policies you are designing are interfering with other rights. So it's not that we waive our rights. They are just not recognized in the creation of these policies. And the thing is that there is this mantra that human rights are universal, indivisible, interrelated, interdependent. Well, yes. Then why the FCTC only focus on health, right? There should be limits, and well, they don't want.
Thank you, Tomas. David, perhaps if you could touch upon what you have presented and where you come from thought-wise on this one.
Sure. I've been involved in doing work to reduce smoking for 40 years or more. And I spent the first part of my career with a group called the Non-Smokers' Rights Association, which was like the most effective anti-smoking lobby group in the world. And we were making the case for rights, the right to be protected from secondhand smoke. You can be on an airplane without feeling ill. If you had medical conditions aggravated by smoke, you should not be subjected to that, et cetera. And in those days, cigarette companies would set up groups called smokers' rights associations to try to argue for the right to smoke and to smoke wherever you want. And we'd make the argument that if you're actually talking about rights, smokers' rights should be things like the right to proper information, adequate information to make informed decisions, the rights to have alternatives to the products that you have, et cetera. And we're still there. And I think this is pretty basic stuff, because when we talk about human rights, or in law, when we talk about people's fundamental rights, I think we can take it back a long way, because the concepts are really straightforward. We go back to the sort of stuff Karen Armstrong has written about in the book The Great Transformation, her studies of religion. And 2,000 to 2,500 years ago, worldwide, major religions got into this idea and philosophy of the golden rule, that, empathy, you should care about other people, that they aren't just objects in your way. You need to understand how they feel about things. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And those principles have been well established. If we look at the Enlightenment and the role not just of science and reason, but of humanism. We care about people. We want a better world for people. And when we think of what we've accomplished with the principles of the Enlightenment and, conflicts disclosed, I'm a fan of the Enlightenment. I think it's a way better idea than things like inquisitions. Inquisitions can be more fun, granted. But the whole idea of saying, let's respect individuals. Let's pursue humanism. Let's do the sorts of things that public health has adopted, because it's not just public health in law, but we see this in professional ethics. We see it in constitutions, because it keeps reflecting this idea that human beings have fundamental rights. So public health comes down to basic things like try to understand people's lived experience. Why are they behaving the way they are? Right? And do things like meet them where they are, rather than saying, I'm going to tell you what to do. And empower them to make better decisions about their own health. Give them the information, give them the options, work with them. In fact, the very things that the World Health Organization has in its charter from 1946, that, and to quote, informed opinion and active cooperation on the part of the public are of the utmost importance in the improvement of the health of the people. It wasn't like the World Health Organization suddenly thought about that at the end of the Second World War. It said, this is basic stuff about humanism and human rights. It's been established over centuries. It's now reflected in constitutions of various countries like my own. It has been used in countries like Canada to pursue things like the right to a safe injection site for people who are using drugs, the right to the attainment of the highest possible standard of health, the right to life, a respect for individuals, meet them where they are, and be pragmatic. This isn't a matter of telling people how to live, it's a matter of doing what works. And job number one is reduce the likelihood of death, injury, and disease. How do we do that? And rather than being judgmental, we just simply look at the things that work. So I think that these principles are really well established. We've seen them used many times on, as the booklet that's just been passed out before this meeting talks about on things like HIV/AIDS, the ACT UP groups to push for human rights on AIDS. We've seen it in other issues of drugs. In Canada, we have litigation that not only gave us safe injection sites in medical marijuana, but litigation that is now being pursued on things like safe supply of drugs and decriminalization of drugs. Because the criminalization of drugs reduces people's choice. It forces them to use something that's more hazardous. They're more likely to get sick and die because they're not being given the safer product. They do not have access to the safer product. Criminalization adds to harm. Well, how is that any different than the arguments that are being made, including in Canada now in litigation, on things like access to vaping products? That it's simply a denial of rights. It's a denial of the right to life to say, we are going to create a situation that forces you to use a more hazardous product than what you'd otherwise want. Like, how can you justify that in a rights-based society?
Thank you. That was incredible. To just go back to a couple of a point that you had made, wherein, like for example, tobacco companies actually put together these things about the right to have a smoke and so on. Now, we are a people's movement. Literally, that's what we are. We are all former smokers. We are all or tobacco users of some form or the other. All of us are consumers, and so here we are fighting for our rights to do these things. And the minute that we do, then we seem to have these kind of large interest groups that seem to be clamping down hard on us. In fact, even denying us the right to assemble, even things of right to research. For example, in India, they have banned research on tobacco harm reduction products. And then they're going out and telling us there is an absence of research. How does these things work, And what would be your idea to kind of throw into that thing? I mean, do we join smokers group and say, hey, we have picked a safer product and why don't you back us up or something like that? I don't know. It is just an idea,
Sure. As a lawyer, I'm very keen on the idea of precedent. And there's a tendency to look at any problem that comes along like, my gosh, this is something new. Nobody's ever encountered this before. What on earth are we going to do about it? My experience, much in life is like a Shakespearean play that you've already seen 16 times. And if you're sitting down to watch the play and the person next to you says, hey, I think Caesar's going to be okay this time. They don't get it. The same sorts of things go on and on and on. So I would look at what's happened in other cases. There used to be tremendous stigma over things like, what if a woman wanted contraception? Oh my God. How do we prevent this from happening? There was opposition, as some of you may know, to women riding bicycles. They might wear bloomers. How could civilization even survive something like that? What if a couple is courting and they're on bicycles? They get out of sight of the chaperone, and what would happen to their reputations, the reputations of their families? And that's before we get into things like HIV/AIDS and what we were hearing this morning about the stigma. And it's been repeated. What we see on illicit drugs. Just say no. Just stop doing that. And when we look at how rights have been enforced, in many of these cases, it has been from the individuals who are at risk taking action. And in many cases, they're human rights actions. So when, how did we get safe injection sites in Canada? Litigation from people who are otherwise going to die if they couldn't have access to these things. People like Mark Tyndall playing a key role in it. What was the role of public health? To wait until the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada on whether the safe injection site was going to be able to survive when the government was trying to close it down, with padlocks ready to put on the door, assuming the Supreme Court would say you couldn't have safe injection sites. They didn't think anything beyond that. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously people have a right to life and that the safe injection site was okayed. How did we get gay marriage? Litigation by people who wanted to get married, and the law was saying you couldn't. And human rights. We've seen these things happen so many times on so many issues that, again, it is like that Shakespearean play, and cut to the chase, Caesar doesn't do okay. It is the same thing over and over again. And I think we can learn a whole lot from that, and that's why I like the idea of sort of looking at the historic flow to say what has worked historically, because those sorts of things are going to work again. And that human rights don't end because somebody uses a particular type of product rather than another type of product. If you've got a right to life, if you've got a right to be able to communicate accurate information, you've got a right. And we see the progress that's made on things like that, and it's a matter of staying with it, and then as litigation works in some places or legislation works in other places, it gets picked up elsewhere. And we can see good policy is contagious. Good legal reasoning is contagious. It starts spreading around the world.
Thank you. Fiona, one of the things that we've noticed, at least from the Indian context, is when legislature have to take difficult decisions, we normally kind of just push it to the courts to decide. And so you have somebody coming up with a public interest litigation, and that's how the matters get debated. In fact, even things like moving from diesel fuel to compressed natural gas in India, for example, it took a court to take a decision and not the government, because it was a difficult decision, and so there were many people. And so now the courts really aren't the most knowledgeable. They are going to discuss a point of law. And so when you are looking at this and this divide of a legislator needing to cope with difficult decisions, how do you keep championing this, and how do you keep going on? That's something that I'm curious about.
Thank you. And I think this is such an interesting subject, and it's, in Australia, in my state of Victoria, we have a Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, but it has absolutely no teeth. And in fact, I'm on the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee, and every fortnight before Parliament we meet. We go through the legislation that's being presented that week, and it's tested against our Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. And quite often it's found lacking. but that doesn't stop the legislation going through. It just says, well, yes, I mean, it doesn't actually meet the Charter of Human Rights, but we're going to do it anyway. So in Australia, while we sort of assume we have human rights, the courts are not going to be able to protect them. So we actually have to do it via legislation. And I think back to how we do it. And I've just recently been able to decriminalise sex work in Victoria. Now, that took 30 odd years to get us there, but it was a human rights argument. And everyone accepted it as a human rights argument. And in actual fact, as part of the legislation, we had sex work included into our charter as a protected attribute. When we looked at, when I was campaigning for the medically supervised injecting room, again, we argued it as a human rights issue, that right to life. In the end, it wasn't the human rights of people who use drugs that got us over the line, I can assure you. It was the NIMBYism of people not liking people overdosing on their front porches that actually won the day. But it has saved millions of lives. And I don't think, when I've been campaigning around vaping, I haven't really run that human rights argument. And I think this has really jogged my mind on this, and to start making that argument, because we did in medicinal cannabis as well. You know, in all of these other areas, in LGBTI rights, in marriage equality, we've argued it from a human rights perspective, and I haven't done it on this. I've done it on drug decriminalisation, you know, but for some reason, even myself as a vapor, as someone who's campaigned on harm reduction, I haven't put the human rights into this argument. So I'm really pleased that we're having this conversation, because I'm already starting to think how we take that back and how we challenge this around the right to life, around the right to good health.
Thank you. That's incredible, because championing it, we normally have this, perhaps we just kind of take it for granted and it kind of hits a blind side, and these are some aspects that kind of just slip through. And when we look at it, and when we have an audience like this who are hopefully going to throw up some good questions, which all of us can take back, mostly you and all of you who are there in ability to change.
Yeah. And I think it goes to the stigma of smoking. And I think it goes to the shame of it that we were talking about we've been speaking about over the days. And so even as someone who vapes, as someone who quit smoking, I didn't actually think that I had a human right. You know, I think that shame and stigma, it has infiltrated some of our conversations around this.
I guess that's what it has. Thank you for being so patient and waiting, Gerry.
Best for last.
Yeah, exactly.
Do I get the difficult question?
We'll start off easy here, okay? To kind of ease you into it, to perhaps shed some light on, you know, your video presentation and what got you into looking in this direction this time.
Well, yes. I mean, you know, I'd echo what's been said about how important it is to have this discussion. I think this is probably the first time in any conference you've had a panel on the right to health and the right to tobacco harm reduction. And we're at very early days in developing those arguments. And I think everybody on the panel would admit that they're no human rights expert, but have been involved in human rights issues in various ways, which has led them to be here today. For me, it's a sort of a bit of a long story, because as many of you know, I was involved in research on HIV/AIDS and drug injecting way back, and doing work on needle exchange and so on, and you know, very interested in access to you know, safer injection sites and so on. But when I gave up academic work, my first retirement in 2004, I just got fed up with doing academic research. I headed the International Harm Reduction Association, and I hired in some human rights experts. And you know, part of that was to look at the very serious abuses that occur to people using drugs around the world. I mean, I've been to countries where drug users are chained to the bed, to help them through detox. There are extrajudicial killings. In many police forces, forced withdrawal is used as a way of encouraging people to confess to things. So there's clearly a lot of very serious abuses and the need to protect drug users from those sorts of abuses. And one of the things we did was we started to track what was happening in UNODC, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and the projects they were supporting, and we discovered that some of the outcome measures for their cross-border projects and so on resulted in more drug users going to prison, resulting in drug users being executed. So we thought, this is madness. So we took it to the donors, because UK was funding projects which resulted in people being executed at the end of the day. And we took it to UNODC, and all the shit hit the fan, because UN is an anti-capital punishment organisation. So there was a big lesson there about how to use that to bring about change within the UN system. And I'm not sure if there are parallels now, but we used the UN bit of human rights as a pressure point to get change in UNODC. But then there was a further development, so that's kind of protecting drug users from abuse. But there was a further development, which I think is very interesting and much more pertinent to what we're talking about today, which was about the right of drug users to have decent treatment, the right of drug users to have sterile syringes and so on. So we worked with the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, and over a considerable period, began to get an argument into the UN system that being a drug user doesn't deny you access to health. Some of this discussion we've had already here, being a smoker should not deny you, your rights. And that kind of, that gave us a bit of rights in practice, at least in the UN system, because working with the UN Special Rapporteurs on the right to health, and we'd also work with the Special Rapporteurs on extrajudicial killings on other issues. And that language permeated into the UN system, so that there's UN General Assembly meetings and so on, where the right to health for drug users was clearly established, the right to have access to methadone, the right to have access to sterile syringes and so on. So once you get that into place, you can then start to sort of pursue that through other bits of the international human rights system, which we might return to in a minute. But I think you can see kind of the read across to here, because the right to health is the right to resources to avoid damaging yourself. So the right to health with safer nicotine products is the right to have access to those in place of other products. So developing that argument, I think, becomes a stronger, we can develop a strong case, arguing against bans and inappropriate regulation and so on.
Well, I'm just curious about one thing. Now, we seem to, nicotine really is just as good or bad as caffeine, okay? And it's more of a dependence rather than an addiction. We have a tendency to call these things addictions, which I think is part of the problem, because then we immediately start getting classified into the really harmful substances that we have. But then when we are talking, for example, on the kind of amazing work that has been going on now, at least in acknowledging and admitting, human rights of the drug users and the rehabilitation programs, and forming alliances with these people and looking at those for examples. How would you say that it would work, especially when you are actually lesser of the evils, if that were really a word? I mean, it's after all a dependence.
I think, and I've always thought, that the tobacco harm reduction movement needs to make strong links with other bits of the harm reduction movement. It's a slow business, because many of our drugs harm reduction colleagues and alcohol harm reduction colleagues are not really particularly interested in tobacco harm reduction. We need to make alliances there, and we also need to make alliances with people who are working in human rights organisations. They have the expertise, they've done the challenges, they've done the work on reproductive rights, access to AIDS treatment and all of those other things. So that's where we need to, there's a big gap in what we do at the moment. We've developed advocacy, we have big conferences, we energize people, and we've got nicotine consumer groups and so on. But we do need to kind of skill up in that respect. We do need to build alliances with people who've worked in other human rights fields.
Anyone? Fiona, could you add to something like that?
In my mind, I'm pulling together a to-do list for myself when I get home, and I know that so in the supervised injecting room in Sydney for a number of years now, they have been encouraging their clients to take nicotine patches as they leave the centre. It hasn't been very successful. I don't think it's actually helped a single one of the clients stop smoking, but they are very acutely aware that they are saving their clients' lives from a heroin overdose or using an overdose, but their clients will die from smoking-related illnesses. And however, when I have conversations with those same organisations that manage those centres, when I start talking about vaping or other safer nicotine products, a kind of a wall goes down, and we're not having those conversations. And in fact, I was speaking to a very senior harm reduction pioneer in Melbourne before I came, and I told him where I was going, and he just went, right. Now, this is a man who has advocated for drug law reform. This is a person who has advocated for the rights of the LGBTI community. This is a man who was on the International Harm Reduction Association with Gerry. And yet, when I start talking about tobacco harm reduction, this wall goes down, do you know the sort of people you'll be mixing with? It's sort of... I know, look, actually, I hope no one's photographing this. Oh, that's right, we're live streaming it, damn. And also the Human Rights Law Centre, who has been a great ally of mine in many of the other cases many of the other campaigns we've run. I've never spoken to them about vaping, and I will be when I get home.
Tomas, you've have faced some unique challenges, and you have actually overcome some of them in the Mexico context, when it came to vaping bans and so on and so forth. Now, we are LMICs, and where we come from, we have got this blanket ban sitting there. It's not that products are not available. I continue to vape. I'm sure it's the case in Mexico as well, because you're always going to find products making their way. I mean, if drugs are available, drugs are obviously banned, they're available. Here's a safer alternative. I'm definitely going to seek them out, which is what I've been doing and managing fine. How was it that you were able to actually pull it together? I mean, did you actually find the voice of reason somewhere, or was it, was it an epiphany or something? But how did this change actually come about?
Well, there haven't been any changes. I mean, the president just rebanned commercialization. The thing is that in LMIC's prohibition is like trying to stop a wave with an umbrella. E-cigarettes are a wave. They will become unstoppable, and the best way to help people to quit smoking is to regulate them, but they don't want to. Now, what happened in Mexico? In Mexico, we have lived since 2008 with provision in the anti-tobacco law, which banned commercialization in very similar terms that the provision contained in the Western Australia state law. It was not an express provision, but through interpretation, e-cigarettes were banned, not the use, the commercialization. Through time, the Supreme Court, in several cases, in lawsuits called amparo lawsuits filed by merchants, by shops, they ruled that the ban, the blanket ban, was unconstitutional. And then, surprisingly, in 2019, the second chamber of the Supreme Court ruled that the ban was constitutional. We have a legal precedent saying that it was unconstitutional and a couple of sentences saying that it was constitutional. And then there was something, one of the ministers filed for this contradiction in order to determine which criterion should prevail. And on October 19 of 2021, the Supreme Court ruled that the blanket ban was unconstitutional. A great thing about that resolution is that all those precedents were based on commercial equality principles. But the ministers, during the discussion, they introduced autonomy, they introduced freedom of commerce and other rights in order to come to the conclusion that these products should be regulated and not banned. We were very happy. We had, this last year was a good year for vaping. But on May 31st, we had a new decree, and our government, our president, insisted that these products should be banned. On what grounds? Health protection. Something, I know the Mexican ban has been commented in several moments at the GFN, but maybe you don't know that 2 weeks earlier, the government launched a maximum, that's the name, maximum sanitary alert against vaping. And one of the most prominent ideas to supporting that alert was vitamin E acetate. It just came 3 years later. So you can imagine the disinformation and the attitude of our government. But this is an LMIC, and with some difficulty, we are still able to get these products.
No, because LMICs are not, uniquely disadvantaged, because all the first world countries seem to be doing pretty much the same. And, and when you actually look at, for example, the problem that Swedish snus is having, right? And here is something that's worked. It's probably the biggest harm reduction tool there, with 100 years of data there to show that things are actually going down. But then the EU is looking at it, as something that needs to be kept away. And not too much effort is going on this one. And so if there are lessons that LMICs should take, in fighting such requirements, what would you have to say about something like this, David? And how does a first world country challenge it? And what hope does an LMIC have if, all the knowledge which is out there is not really getting put to use?
Sure, I think, again, it's that Shakespearean play we've already seen so many times. The same sort of patterns are repeating themselves, and I think it helps to think about some of them. Like how often when someone comments about somebody being overweight, do they make a moral judgment rather than a public health one? How often when talking about any sort of behavior, poverty, why are people poor? How many people make a moral judgment? And I think as a species, we tend, the fast and slow thinking, our quick response tends to be a moralistic response, a judgmental response. And then we have to actually engage our frontal lobes to think about, well, wait a minute, what's actually going on here and what can I practically do about it? And I think Swedish snus is a really good example of that, and a really good test that when you're dealing with people who are opposed to reduce risk for people who are using nicotine, to see, do they pass the snus test? Will they at least accept that Sweden accomplished great things by having an alternative? Because what you find is that they won't. And they won't because they're not in that reason frontal lobe category. They're still in that moralistic, I'm fighting evil category. They're still involved in the Inquisition, not the Enlightenment, right? They're not looking at science and reason and taking into account humanism. And I think that's the same battle that we have again and again. And this has been written up so well in things like Brandt's History of Venereal Disease, No Magic Bullet, of how we blamed individuals, the history of trying to get to auto safety. No, what you need is a spike right in the center of the steering wheel at the driver's chest. Because the reason people get into accidents is they're not paying enough attention. It's their fault. This is a moral failure on the part of drivers. I mean, that's true. That's part of the history. Look at the history of the Comstock laws in the United States on reproductive rights, women's rights, Anthony Comstock. Contraception was banned. And in fact, in many wealthy countries, including as I was hitting adulthood, contraception was illegal for single women. Now, do you think that was based on good, practical public health principles? Or maybe a little bit of moralism came in there? And so I think the patterns are there, and how do we focus people on getting pragmatic? And I think we can look at some of the history of these other issues of how people got around the rules, because when we talk about things like vaping products being banned or the restrictions on them, well, so were contraceptive devices. But families weren't huge back then. I mean, people found ways to get around the rules. When there's been bans on pharmaceutical products in various countries that are beneficial to certain people in those countries, they find them. The history of innovation, the stuff from Big Bang Disruption, Downs and Noons, which is that you can't stop innovation. It will happen. You can slow it down, and nothing can slow it down more than regulation. No form of regulation more than health regulation. No health regulation more than the FDA regulation. But even the FDA can't stop it. It's going to happen. People are going to get these things. So for us, the question is, how do you speed that up? And how do you do that in country after country? Who are potential allies? Who's standing in the way of that progress? So now I just think we're in a crazy situation where you've got, on the one hand, anti-nicotine extremists who think they're fighting the tobacco industry by preventing people from getting access to anything other than cigarettes, which just happens to be where the tobacco industry makes their money. And tobacco companies are making cigarettes saying we'd like to transform, but the last thing they're going to do is really facilitate the transformation by making available the evidence as to how rapidly people can transition off cigarettes, which happens to be where they make their money. I mean, how do we start getting rational discussions about these sorts of things? And again, engage those frontal lobes so people aren't just saying, I'm fighting evil, big tobacco evil, I'll fight anything they do. How do we get regulators, politicians to start thinking more deeply about these things? How did we get into this idea that the way to deal with anything to do with tobacco is a knee-jerk opposition to anything any tobacco company tries to do? Because most people learn by the age of 3 that simply disagreeing with someone, no matter what they do or say, doesn't get you very far. As a 3-year-old, where your older brother says, it's rainy outside, say, no, it's sunny. That's really funny, right? The grass is green. No, it's orange. And it doesn't take very long until your 5-year-old brother says, I think you're smarter than a rock, right? And wait a minute. And what's amazing is an awful lot of what goes on and what passes for a public health community hasn't yet got to that 3-year-old level of logic to realize maybe I don't do really well by simply attacking and disagreeing with anything they ever try to do. Maybe I should actually try to think of a broader goal here of what I'm trying to accomplish.
Gerry, you wanted to?
Yeah, because you asked a question about legal challenge and you mentioned snus, and of course the huge difficulty is in the ban on the sale of snus within the European Union, for which in fact the UK was responsible. So that's a bit of the damage we did to the European Union before we decided to get out of the European Union eventually. But that has been subject to legal challenge unsuccessfully, and there was a case started in 2017 brought by Swedish Match, one of the main producers of snus, arguing that the ban was discriminatory against the product, that it was against the principle of subsidiarity of nation states to make their own rules and regulations, and there were a few other issues as well. I was then working with the New Nicotine Alliance, and it was unlike many people on the panel here, I'm not a vapor. I'm I tried to be a smoker years ago, but I never actually liked nicotine. And, and since, you know...
Moral failing there.
Moral failing, I know. And, you know,
Try harder.
try harder, yeah. And, you know, when people say, well, it might protect against dementia, I tried again. But it doesn't work for me. But nevertheless, I was kind of an honorary non-vapor member of the New Nicotine Alliance. And when Swedish Match brought this case, we thought, it's interesting, because you can join a case as a third-party intervener. So the case had to be brought by Swedish Match in the UK High Court, but then when it was agreed there was a case to answer, because it's based on EU legislation, it had to be passed to the European Court of Justice. So the argument that the NNA developed was not the commercial argument that Swedish Match was developing, but it was a right to health protection argument, that people had the right to have access to a product which would help to prevent them suffering severe disease or premature death. And the principles were based on several elements of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, about dignity, which is kind of autonomy, about right to health care, respect for private life, and elements of the European Charter about encouraging responsibility, individual responsibility for health, which is all good stuff. So we were kind of the add-on to the case, and it takes ages to do this. It's like 2 or 3 years, and it's quite fun, going to meet. I had to learn bits of law and all those other sorts of things, and going to the European Court of Justice, and some people in the room were there as my supporters when we were at the European Court of Justice. But it got knocked out. But it got knocked out really on the commercial grounds about, it was about the issue of proportionality. That, was it legitimate for the European Union to make law in this area to, prevent the sale of a particular product? And the kind of the human rights stuff was always like rejected as a kind of an add-on, and they sort of said, well, you can do some stuff and sometimes you have to ignore human rights to do other things. So it didn't really take much notice of our argument. But they can't really say that, but they did say that. But I think the lesson there was that perhaps we shouldn't have been pursuing this at the European Court of Justice, which is dealing with very fundamental commercial and other issues about European law, but we should have considered going to the European Court of Human Rights, and I think that would be an interesting step to pursue for those who want to promote the use or change the law about snus. And the kind of argument there would be that I am from maybe Sweden and I'm living in Germany, and I'm denied access to this thing that could, protect me from mental health. So I have a legal right to the product I was able to use in Sweden, and I should have that legal right elsewhere in the EU. I haven't really thought that one through, but I think that would be the kind of case that might be of some kind of interest. But of course, all this costs money. Lawyers don't come cheap, do they? two rich lawyers on the end of the panel here. They're very dear. They're not denying that. So you need to get pro bono advice and so on, or get somebody interested in this. But I think we need to begin. I was interested. The Mexican example, and of course in India you've had legal challenges as well. And I don't know how that was all paid for and all the rest of it, but we need to start making those challenges. We won't necessarily win.
In tobacco control and in tobacco harm reduction, what's the reason, or was it kind of missed or forgotten, or was it deliberate? I mean, that's something that still not been able to work out.
Well, I was under the impression that the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control had been informed by human rights, but then I read some material from one of the legal counsel to WHO at the time, Alan Taylor, and it appeared that the FCTs, the preamble refers to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Article 12, which is the right to health bit in that international treaty. So it's there in the preamble, but the FCTC, the convention itself, is not informed by human rights. And I understand that in the development of the FCTC, this was never raised by countries or by NGOs. And there had been some internal discussions about avoiding this. because it was a kind of dodgy area to get into, in particular because many tobacco companies had been pursuing the right to smoke argument, and it was thought, I believe, that there wasn't a strong enough case to try to get FCTC through countries on a right to health or human rights basis, but it's more on the interdependence of nations, economic interests, and public health. So it's not informed by, the FCTC is not informed by human rights or health rights thinking. And so that leaves a gap for tobacco controllers to work out what the human rights angle might be. And unfortunately, that's mainly developed along the lines of protecting people from the tobacco industry and protecting people from tobacco. It hasn't developed along the lines that we've been discussing here about the right to access safer products. And the absence of human rights in the FCTC is kind of also linked to the neglect of the harm reduction bit of FCTC. You know, I was in drugs work for years, in drugs policy work, and we never had the harm reduction language there, and it was always excluded for one reason or another. The United States, mainly the problem here, that you couldn't use the words harm reduction in any international agreements under there's something called the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is rather like COP in our field. And I've been in interminable meetings where people were jumping around. The UK and the EU wanted harm reduction in there, and the US and Russia and others didn't want it in there. And one meeting, I think, after days of discussion, harm reduction was defined as access to appropriate support services. Like this interminable wrangling over the language. So that, when I read Article, FCTC Article 1D, and their words harm reduction are in there, I thought, whoopee, as I did when I first came across tobacco harm reduction, I thought all my public health colleagues would be as enthusiastic as I am about this, but we know doesn't happen that way. So the harm reduction bit has been neglected, and also the human rights and the health rights bit has been neglected. So what we've got to do, there is a developing narrative about protecting people from smoke, protecting the kids, protecting people from the tobacco industry, protecting people from tobacco, but we need to grab a narrative, and there's a gap there. We need to grab a narrative which is about human rights and enabling people to make those choices to lead kind of safer lives. So I think there is a good opportunity to develop that alternative narrative and to offset that narrative, which is entirely about protection from the evils of the industry and the evils of tobacco.
Well, my government in India, at least, gives me the right to smoke. I mean, they own 30% of the largest tobacco industry in India, so it gives me the right to smoke. But taking it from there, Fiona, wouldn't that...
Sorry, it just reminded me of just a quick anecdote. Many years ago, I was a lobbyist for the adult industry, and I wrote to the Cancer Council one year and suggested that cigarettes should be restricted to adult premises, and that you should only sell cigarettes from age-restricted premises, and adult shops would be very good for that. By the way, and I got a letter back saying, "Oh, no, that's a bit extreme." They thought that restricting cigarettes to adult premises or to places where children couldn't go was going far too far for the human rights of smokers, and that really it wasn't. That was far too restrictive. And this is the same organisation that is called, that has effectively banned safer nicotine products in my country.
So if smoking, and I do have a right to smoke, I mean, wouldn't it flow that I have a right to a safer alternative? I mean, the same argument, wouldn't it?
It should, and I think this is something, I don't know if someone can offer some assistance to me, because I've been thinking about this, and, when I go back and I argue that case, what the response from authorities will be, well, you can get a prescription for it. So we're not prohibiting you from getting it, we're making it near impossible to get, but we're not prohibiting. And I wonder, so how do I tease out that argument that because they have given me access through a prescription process, that they haven't denied me my access?
David, if you...
Sure. I think important to distinguish between rights and privileges. Things like, my right to swing my fist is not really a right, it's a limited privilege. It ends where somebody else's face begins. Smoking can be seen that way, that you can do this, but you can't do it in a way that harms other people. When you get to a right to health, we're talking about an actual right, something that's absolute and that ties into this idea of respect for others, the principles in public health about meeting people where they are, which answers Fiona's point about when somebody says, oh, you've got a problem, here's what we can do for you. So if I say, I need to get back to Canada very, very quickly, and you say, terrific, I can get you a bus to Berlin. Well, that doesn't quite do it for me. Just like for somebody to say, we can give you a patch. If somebody has a dependence on amphetamines, you don't say, I can get you an espresso. You're not meeting them where they are. You're not meeting their needs. And then that's a purely pragmatic aspect of public health, to say, where we find risk, we seek to reduce it. And we do that, like the World Health Organization says you're supposed to do, by working with people, informing people, giving people options, giving people realistic options. And that's why it doesn't make sense when you say things like, well, we don't need to make snus available because we've got a different product available. Well, what if that different product doesn't appeal to somebody and snus does? We wouldn't say things like, we're trying to improve the physical fitness of the population, and that's why we're going to build volleyball courts around the city. But that's all. No biking, no walking, forget about chin-up bars, no gyms. We've got the solution for you. You're all going to play volleyball. And we'll just tell you when you're playing volleyball and where you're playing volleyball. If you don't show up, you're going to get fined. That's the approach that we end up with on a lot of these sorts of policies. That ain't public health. That isn't pragmatic. You're not meeting people where they are. It isn't humanistic. You're not respecting people's autonomy. And it's those basic principles that work well. And I think we just have to keep applying these things to say, does that do it for you? Does this meet your need? Am I meeting you where you are? Am I understanding your experience? Am I empowering you to make a better decision about your own health? Because if you're not doing that, you are getting into the stuff about stigma and moralistic judgments and the just say no sort of thing. Or, if you feel that's your sexual orientation, you're not praying hard enough approach. We've encountered so many of these things, and again, it's the same pattern again and again and again. So the solution is the same things that have worked again and again and again.
Thank you so much for that. And I think it's time now to take the mics around the audience, and if there are any questions, I'm sure you. Okay.
Hello, thank you. It's been a great panel. I would like to ask, because in some countries, there's, it's kind of difficult, the engagement between THR NGOs and other harm reduction NGOs. Do you think that the problem could be that nicotine is not harmful enough?
It certainly kills more people than heroin in my country. Well, the device that provides the nicotine. I think it is really strange because, well, it's not. When we look at why people misuse heroin or misuse methamphetamines or other substances, we quite often go back to trauma. We go back to disadvantage, we go back to a whole range of reasons, and we haven't done that with smoking. And yet, in fact, but if you look at my country, disadvantage is an incredible predictor for smoking. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to smoke. in Australia, and I'd say that's in every country. So I don't know whether that's it. I think we've all, just in harm reduction, we've all swallowed the evil of tobacco, the evil of the tobacco companies, and we haven't really considered harm reduction in tobacco. You know, we've just said, we've been handing out patches at the supervised injecting room where we're, allowing people to inject heroin more in a safer way.
I'd also point out that it is normal for people to, as they catch on to one aspect of human rights, to not get another one, right? And they have to go through that process again. So it's sort of like, I think it's wrong for Protestants to murder Catholics and Catholics to murder Protestants. Now those Muslims, right? Okay, now I get that, but what if they're gay, right? What if they drive an SUV? I think we tend to keep going back to these, moralistic things, and you have to work it through again and again, and it's the same process. I think that's just the nature of us as a species. That's how our brains developed. So we have to force ourselves to use those frontal lobes because our amygdalas get way too much work, and we have to sort of move it up and help people think this through. To look at the parallels, to say, well, isn't that a lot like? And I think that does help people, come around to it. Or why would you, not want to chain up somebody because they've got a mental illness, but it's okay to stigmatize somebody and force them out into the cold because you won't allow them to use nicotine in any way other than smoking it. That sort of thing that I think people can move on to it and get beyond the idea that it's a fight against evil. It's actually a fight for health.
Could we?
Thanks. I think this is enormously important to continue the work. And like with all these things, I think there's a lot of work to be done. But and I think there's sort of a couple of bits. First, I do think Gerry was right on the issue of why we haven't seen this taken on before. We need to also think back 20 years, where the smokers' rights issues were being pushed by the tobacco companies very heavily, and they were a threat to any form of tobacco control, whatever it was. So that was, partly forgivable. The second reason I think I've only come to see properly over the last few years is the fact that there's also a reluctance to address the personal aspects of cessation and everything that involved, and the real sort of diminishing the importance of health professionals in treating people who were smoking and wanted effective treatment, be it cessation or harm reduction. I think that is a big issue going forward, which also may give the clue to going forward. In those early years, there was actually a cross-UN structure where we would meet with the UN Human Rights Commission, UNICEF and others, and talk about coherent policy under the Framework Convention across the UN. And I don't think we stressed the human rights aspects enough for those reasons, but the one that did go a little further was UNICEF. And in fact, we managed to get funding to actually look at how the Convention on the Rights of the Child could be used to advance tobacco control. And a formal report was written. It's actually available on the website. But Carol Bellamy at the time didn't take it any further, so it died on the vine, and I don't know what happened to it. What I think now, looking forward, I would love to see is to really do a serious work, taking this really excellent draft report that we have, to look at where are the areas, the pressure points and opportunities greatest. And I think doing some basic data may very well help us ask whether we should link the access to nicotine replacement therapy to the access to harm reduction and non-pharmaceutical interventions together. And I say that because access to NRTs is accepted under the convention very strongly Yet, and it's on the WHO essential drug list, but work some of us have done have shown that the majority of low-middle income countries, the governments, have refused to actually act on that. So if they have failed to act on the access to nicotine replacement therapy, you can see that it makes it even tougher to think they're going to do this. But linking it together shows that the common thing is they're neglecting the smoker, which I think would be very powerful. Revising the access chart, and I would love to see a chart showing of all the countries that have signed on to the convention, which ones has government agreed to put nicotine replacement therapy onto the access thing, which ones have banned access to harm reduction products, where the similarities, and start trying to build the case to address both if we really want to accelerate the end of smoking, which is part of the brief. The last thing I'd say is that I think that very technical work would need to engage the UN human rights machinery. And there's no shortcoming. But while that's happening, I think this applies to most people in this room, the passion and the drive of building the NGO movement and case for that has to move ahead with politicians, and thrilled to have Fiona give us the guidance on that. And I would set an early goal to test this argument during the UN General Assembly the week. And there will be opportunities, and I'd be happy to talk to people how this might happen, even this year in September, because I think this could be a very powerful argument, particularly given that access is going to be very high on the list in the light of vaccine access being an enormously important issue. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Can we have the mic across to the gentleman there? One's going, yeah.
Hello, everybody. Well, this is more a comment from Panama, Latin America, which is actually happening right now. My legal mate in here wants to say some things in here. Well, in Latin America, specifically in Panama, the government has ratified many international agreements, right? Since that there is a lot of internal or external interest in our country, this kind of agreements looks as a possibility to legalize this new alternative and provide well-made tobacco harm reduction policy, right? We have an article, the 15 of the International Agreement regards on economic, social, and cultural rights of 1966, this one is as an example. It does recognize the rights of Panamanians to participate within the cultural heritage and enjoy the rights of the scientific progress and all that applies within. But the economic interests influence into the decision of our governance and also on the Latin American presidents, right? In Europe, we see that there exists a friendly regulation on a legal perspective. And we say friendly because at least there are some vape shops, right? But in Panama, that does not exist. Which kind of legal perspective was chosen, or which path was taken in order to make it effectively as it is? Kind of. Corruption exists all over the world, but there should be an effective way to achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else with some insights, perhaps?
And
yeah.
Sorry, at the same time, if you guys in there can at least shed a light on which kind of path was chosen in order to make at least the vape shops to exist.
If you ask for an Indian context, those don't exist. They exist underground, and we all have access to them. I mean, if that's of any help.
In Mexico, they exist because the original prohibition wasn't really enforced. There was some enforcement, but in the last month, they have closed most of them. So they are making a black market much more darker market, And yes, someone talked about cartels. I don't know if it was in the previous conference. That's a fear.
Yeah,
The fear is that now drug cartels will have an interest in selling these products, and well, you can imagine the consequences that will arise from that.
Yeah, we have an 87% of counterfeiting on tobacco, combustion tobacco in Panama. So you can imagine how it is right now in there.
Yeah.
Just a very small point. I'm very pleased that there are people here from Panama because COP10 will be in Panama, and we need to help you make a lot of noise.
I think we might have just one question. Yeah, right.
Hello, I'm Ignacio Leiva from Chile, also from the campaign Vaping It's Not Smoking. My question is for Tomas O'Gorman. We know the situation. What is your point of view in the future of Mexico? What you think there is something we can do there? It's so dark, and what will be the consequence that you can, in your perspective, what is coming on Mexico?
I left the crystal ball in Mexico, but you're asking the wrong lawyer. Juanito is other. But no, I think that at least against the new decree, we are collecting decrees. We have already 4 in this presidency. With this new decree, we have the ruling of last year from the Supreme Court, and I'm very confident that both stores and consumers will, I hope, really hope, will be protected by the judicial power from Mexico. The problem is that it shouldn't be this way. You shouldn't be forced to go to tribunals and to judges to defend your rights. At the beginning, when we were down there, I said that I think about law is that is, or usually is, mostly common sense. And harm reduction is common sense. It really is. But as Mr. Sweanor says, when your motivation is ideology and to impose your moral views in the world and to decide how other people should live their lives, well, the first thing that goes to the toilet is common sense, right?
Just a little thing in the same question. Do you think that Bloomberg presence there, we have people like the president and Gattel, that it's directly connected to Bloomberg. Do you think that we have an option to fight when they are that powerful in Mexico, in the political scenario?
I think that vaping associations and people promoting THR are in a very asymmetric relationship with tobacco control. Whether it is money, whether it is political power, whatever. The relationship is profoundly asymmetrical, and well, as long as they keep trying to unlawfully enforce the 5.3 clause of the FCTC, this asymmetry will remain.
I would also point out that money doesn't win a lot of these battles. I mean, having worked with a very small NGO and taken on big tobacco and won repeatedly, I like the line by Ernest Rutherford, which is, gentlemen, we've run out of money, we have to start thinking. And when you look at creative responses to this, and one that immediately comes to mind when we deal with Mexico, how many people in Mexico have died from violence because of US prohibition on drugs? I think it's about 250,000 people so far this century. And the response of the Mexican government when dealing with another drug is that prohibition's a good idea. I mean, I think that's something that's worth airing to say, where does that get us? What's the history on these things? We have seen the history of the US, of the stuff that Lisa Magura talks about in her book, The War on Alcohol, where US alcohol prohibition came from, which is the tendency to want to use the power of the state to impose your moral views on the behavior of others. It's just, this has happened repeatedly in U.S. history, not just, you know, in alcohol and birth control and narcotics and nicotine and, but they have the resources and the culture to say we need to not just impose this on the people in our country, but the rest of the world, which is why Gerry's had to deal with things like, you know, UN protocols on illicit drugs, saying you're not allowed to talk about harm reduction. I don't think it's a hard sell in Mexico to get people to say maybe we should stand up to some of the morality coming out of the United States. So I think that there are various arguments that can be made, but you know, my history as a lawyer and an advocate is to look at the ideas. What are the things that might work here? You know, what could get people's attention? Essentially, what takes us to the frontal lobes so we get people to start thinking?
Thank you.
And I think we win on that because we're right on the science. You know, we're right on reason. We're right on humanism. The Enlightenment's on our side. How do we move this forward? And I think that there's always a way to do that, and there's lessons that we can learn from, you know, the history of other issues and the experience of other countries.
Thank you, David. I think that pretty much sums it up for us. I've already had a couple of warnings in my ear, but it was just a little too engaging, and so I kind of ignored it. But thank you. So thank you, everyone. I'm not going to hold you back from lunch. Thank you, everyone.